Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters. I'm your host Mitch, glad to have you here. Now, usually on this show we build fun and inexpensive focused commander decks on a $25 budget, but today we have an episode of Quests for Quarters. On episodes like these, I'm going to take you through underrated budget cards that you should be considering when you build your decks. For these episodes, not only does every card have to be under $1, but they also have to be used in less than 4,000 decks on EDH Rec. And as always, prices on this show are powered by our sponsor, TCG Player. Before we get started today though, make sure you go check out our new classic pink playmat and Commander's Quarters t-shirts on thecommandersquarters.com. And thank you to everyone who's already purchased our merchandise, it really does help support the channel. Also, make sure that you subscribe to the channel and click that little bell notification icon so that you can stay up to date in the latest Commander's Quarters episodes. My first underrated Quest for Quarters card is War Cadence. War Cadence is currently only 10 cents and is seeing play in just over 800 decks. It's an enchantment that costs 2 and a red, and it says pay X in a red. This turn, creatures can't block unless their controller pays X for each blocking creature they control. This is a fantastic, repeatable way to get creatures through. It doesn't matter how good your opponent's defenses are, if they can't pay for it, they can't block. Even if they can pay for 1 or 2 creatures to block, they still won't be blocking effectively. This can also slow your opponents down and force them to hold up mana just to pay for this. And the best part about this card is you can activate it whenever you want. So not only can this help you get your creatures through, but it can also help your opponents too. You can always make a deal to help someone else get their creatures through on one of your other opponents. If one player's in a dominant position, this can really help everyone else turn the tides on them. This card should be seeing play in a lot more decks, and there aren't really any other cards like it. But let's go through some cards that we can try to compare it to though. Archetype of Imagination is currently seeing play in over 5,000 decks. Essentially it makes it so that all your creatures have flying and your opponent's creatures can't have flying. This essentially makes your creatures unblockable unless your opponent's creatures have reach. This card can definitely be very effective, but it's got some things going against it. First off, it's a creature and it's only a 3/2, so it's very easily removed. On top of that, it does cost 6 mana, so it's a pretty heavy investment up front. Unlike War Cadence though, its effect doesn't cost you anything. But also unlike War Cadence, you really can't use this card politically. I still think Archetype of Imagination is a fantastic card and is a great way to help you get your creatures through. It should definitely be seeing play in as many decks as it is, but War Cadence should be seeing play in just as much or even more. Again, there aren't too many similar cards to War Cadence, but one that is somewhat similar is Bedlam. Bedlam is nearly $1 and is currently seeing play in over 1,000 decks. It's also a red enchantment and it says creatures can't block. Bedlam is a bit more of a chaotic card than War Cadence, since it makes it so that no creatures can block, no one is safe, including yourself. This effect is definitely great in decks where you can force your opponents to attack each other and not you. But I will definitely argue that there are more decks out there that want something like War Cadence instead of Bedlam. You may have to pay for its effect, but again, it's much more flexible. And unlike Bedlam, War Cadence isn't going to leave you wide open. Making it so that your opponent's creatures can't block is a fantastic way to finish them off. Another card that makes use of this is something like Champion of Lambholt. It's a little over $2 and currently seeing play in over 13,000 decks. It starts off as a 1/1, but whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. And then creatures with power less than its power can't block creatures you control. So like Archetype of Imagination, Champion of Lambholt is a creature which can easily be dealt with. But Champion of Lambholt only costs 3 mana and can actually become a huge threat in itself. Decks are definitely looking for ways to finish off their opponents, and Champion of Lambholt is a great one in green. I'm not going to say that War Cadence is better than Champion of Lambholt overall, but it's definitely better in certain situations. The fact that it's only seeing play in less than 1,000 decks is absolutely absurd to me. A card like Champion of Lambholt definitely shows the need for cards like these that finish out the game. Finally, let's take a look at Cover of Darkness. It's currently over $11 and is seeing play in 2,100 decks. It's an enchantment that costs 1 and a black, and it says when it comes into play, choose a creature type. Creatures of the chosen type have fear. Now, Cover of Darkness is a fantastic card in a tribal deck. Giving your creatures fear doesn't get them through all the time, but it'll get them through a lot of the time. I imagine that if this card wasn't $11, it would be seeing play in a lot more decks. That being said, I still think War Cadence is a more effective card even at just 10 cents. As I mentioned before, fear doesn't guarantee unblockability. Now, War Cadence doesn't either, but it makes it pretty much impossible for your opponents to block effectively. While you can use Cover of Darkness politically with other tribal decks, you're really not going to be counting on that. War Cadence is much more flexible and should be seeing play in a lot more decks than Cover of Darkness in my opinion. Again, War Cadence is a very unique card and can really help you finish out games. There are definitely a ton of decks out there that War Cadence would fit right into. My next underrated card is Fanatical Devotion. Currently it's only 24 cents and is seeing play in nearly 700 decks. It's an enchantment for 2 and a white and it says sacrifice a creature, regenerate target creature. In my opinion, this card is severely undervalued and underplayed. To be honest, I had never heard of this card before I started building my Taste of Karlov deck, and it's one of the best sacrifice outlets in it. Aristocrat style strategies revolve around free sacrifice outlets. Since it's free, you can activate it as many times as you want at a moment's notice, whereas outlets that you actually have to pay for are much more limited. On top of that, Fanatical Devotion is an enchantment which is much harder to deal with than a creature. For the most part, enchantments that are free sacrifice outlets are pretty hard to come by. What makes this card even better is that its effect is actually relevant. Aristocrat style decks have a ton of sacrifice fodder out there, and being able to just sacrifice one of those creatures to protect a key piece is huge. Perhaps one of the more comparable cards to this is Spirit Bonds. It's currently seeing play in over 3 times as many decks and is around 30 cents. It's an enchantment for 1 and a white, and it says whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay white. If you do, put a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying onto the battlefield, and then you can pay 1 and a white to sacrifice a spirit to make target non-spirit creature indestructible until end of turn. turn. So Spirit Bonds does allow you to create creature tokens, but at a cost. And on top of that, it actually is going to cost you if you want to use those spirits to protect your creatures. Although indestructibility might be better, regeneration is still very effective. And as I mentioned before, a free sacrifice outlet is always going to be better than one that you have to pay for. Fanatical Devotion is just a much better card. It should be seen play in a lot more decks than Spirit Bonds is. Another comparable card to Fanatical Devotion is Martyr's Cause. Martyr's Cause is currently around $3 and is seeing play in over 1,000 decks. It's also an enchantment with the exact same mana cost, and it says sacrifice a creature. The next time a source of your choice would deal damage to any target this turn, prevent that damage. This is a fantastic card that should definitely be seeing more play in more Aristocrats decks than it is. Fanatical Devotion is going to be better at helping you protect your creatures, but Martyr's Cause is going to be better at helping you protect yourself. But again, any kind of a free sacrifice outlet that's hard to deal with is pretty valuable though. Even if these enchantments practically had no effect other than allowing you to freely sacrifice creatures, I'd still run them. Perhaps no card demonstrates the value of free sacrifice outlets quite like Ashnod's Altar. It's nearly $5 and is seeing play in over 37,000 decks. It's an artifact that costs 3 that allows you to sacrifice a creature to add colorless colors to your mana pool. Yes, this is an extremely valuable and even broken effect, and we can't really compare Fanatical Devotion or Martyr's Cause to it. But at over 37,000 decks, this is just showing you how many decks out there are looking for free sacrifice outlets. Even a card like Spawning Pit is currently seeing play in over 3,000 decks. It's an artifact that costs 2, and it says sacrifice a creature, put a charge counter on Spawning Pit. You can then pay 1 to remove 2 charge counters from it to put a 2/2 into play. As an outlet and a token generator, this is definitely an underplayed card as well. Again, for Aristocrat style decks, I'm looking for 2 things from sacrifice outlets. The first part is that they are free so that I can activate them as many times as I want at a moment's notice. And the second part is that they're hard to deal with so that they stick around. In my opinion, certain people depend on creature-based sacrifice outlets far too much. Many of these sacrifice outlets that I've mentioned are very underrated, especially Fanatical Devotion. It should be seeing play in a lot more decks, so if you have an Aristocrat style deck with white, make sure that you're using it. And then another underrated Quest for Quarters card is Grow from the Ashes. It's currently around 14 cents and is seeing play in 3,500 decks. It's a sorcery for 2 and a green that has a kicker for 2, and it says search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, and then shuffle your library. If this spell was kicked, instead search your library for 2 basic lands, put them onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. I've definitely been on the record before for talking out against mana ramp spells that cost 3. But Grow from the Ashes is one exception that I'll make. First off, it puts a land onto the battlefield untapped, so it essentially only costs you 2 mana. If that's all that it did though, I definitely wouldn't be interested in this card. But the fact that you can just kick it for 2 more mana for an extra land makes it extremely flexible. There aren't too many flexible mana ramp spells out there, and this one can be effective early and later in the game. In terms of playable ramp spells that get you 2 lands, there aren't too many of them out there. One of the more popular ones out there though is definitely Explosive Vegetation, which is around 70 cents and is seeing play in over 33,000 decks. The main difference between these 2 cards is that Explosive Vegetation puts its lands into play tapped. Now, this is definitely a good ramp spell for certain decks, but I think Grow from the Ashes is just better. Basically, the only time that Explosive Vegetation is going to be more effective is when you have exactly 4 mana. If you have 3 mana, you can cast Grow from the Ashes, but you can't cast Explosive Vegetation. At 4, Explosive Vegetation is going to get you 2 lands, and Grow from the Ashes can only get you 1. But at 5 or more mana, Grow from the Ashes essentially costs you less since those lands come into play untapped. Grow from the Ashes is starting to get a little more respect than it was getting, but it should definitely be seeing more play than it is. A somewhat similar card to Grow from the Ashes is Primal Growth. It essentially costs the exact same, does the exact same thing, but its kicker is sacrifice a creature instead of pay 2. There are definitely decks that are looking to sacrifice creatures, but I'd say that there are more decks that are looking for something like Grow from the Ashes. For most decks out there, paying 2 is a lot less steep of a price than having to sacrifice a creature. Another somewhat comparable card that gets 2 lands is Burnished Heart. It's currently over $3 and sees play in over 40,000 decks. It's a 2/2 for 3 that you can pay 3 and sacrifice it to get 2 basic lands and put them onto the battlefield tapped. Yes, Burnished Heart can be used in any deck since it is an artifact, but Grow from the Ashes is simply better. Burnished Heart can get you those lands for a total of 6 mana, whereas Grow from the Ashes essentially does it for 3. Burnished Heart does have its place in certain decks, but I do think that it's overplayed. In any deck that has green, Grow from the Ashes is simply going to be better. But perhaps the most overplayed ramp spell, in my opinion, is Cultivate. Currently it's around $1 and is seeing play in over 68,000 decks. It's a sorcery with the same mana cost, and it says search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, reveal those cards, put 1 onto the battlefield tapped and the other into your hand, then shuffle your library. I'm still going to argue that pretty much any ramp spell that costs 2 is just going to be better than Cultivate, but I'm also going to argue that Grow from the Ashes is better than it too. Unlike Grow from the Ashes, Cultivate only has the potential to ramp you for 1 land. And on top of that, that land comes into play tapped. Grow from the Ashes is just a much more flexible card than Cultivate. And once you hit 5 mana, there's essentially no arguing that Grow from the Ashes is better. Again, I will always prefer mana ramp that costs 2, but Grow from the Ashes is pretty good for a 3 mana ramp spell. In my opinion, it's definitely better than Cultivate and should be seeing play in a lot more decks than it is. My final underrated Quest for Quarters card is going to be Spell Swindle. Currently it's a little over 50 cents and is seeing play in less than 3,000 decks. It's an instant for 3 blue that says counter target spell. Create X colorless treasure artifact tokens where X is that spell's converted mana cost. They have tap, sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. This is a fantastic counter spell that should be seeing play in a lot more decks than it is. Although it does cost you 5 mana, it can easily get you that mana back plus more. The original card that we can compare this to is Mana Drain. Currently, Mana Drain is over $80 and is seeing play in 11,000 decks. If it was a more affordable card, it would definitely be seeing play in pretty much every single blue deck. It's an instant for blue and it says counter target spell at the beginning of your next main phase, add an amount of colorless mana to your mana pool equal to that spell's converted mana cost. Mana Drain costs 3 less, which is very significant. I'm definitely not going to argue that spell Swindle is anywhere near as good as Mana Drain. But although it costs 3 mana, it does have its advantages though. There are plenty of decks that revolve around artifacts, so creating a ton of them at once is huge. Also, since it gives you that mana in the form of treasures, you can essentially use them whenever you want. Mana Drain's mana is only colorless, and it makes you use that mana at the beginning of your next main phase. Now, it more than makes up for that for costing 3 less, but again, I'm just trying to illustrate the point that these kinds of effects are very effective in Magic. Even a card like Plasm Capture is seeing more than twice as much play than Spell Swindle. It essentially does the exact same thing as Mana Drain, but it costs green, blue, and it adds that mana as a combination of any colors you want. Its converted mana cost is 1 less than Spell Swindle, but it's also a much more restrictive mana cost. And again, as I mentioned before, Spell Swindle's mana can be used whenever you want. Plasm Capture is very effective in certain decks, and those decks should also be running Spell Swindle. Spell Swindle is easier to cast, and it's a much more flexible card. Because of this, I definitely think it should be seeing more play than Plasm Capture. Regardless, all these are very powerful and rare effects in Magic. To illustrate this, let's look at one final, somewhat comparable card. Scattering Stroke costs around 9 cents and is seeing play in just over 300 decks. It's an instant for 2 blue that says counter target spell, clash with an opponent. If you win at the beginning of your next main phase, you may add X to your mana pool, where X is that spell's converted mana cost. So essentially, this is a much worse version of Mana Drain that costs 2 more and has a decent chance of not working. There's a reason that these effects aren't printed on cards very much, because it is a very powerful effect. They definitely downgraded the Mana Drain effect for Scattering Stroke to make it unplayable. But that's nowhere near the case for Spell Swindle, and it should be seeing more play in more decks than it is. And with that, this show is coming to a close, but I really just want to hear about what you guys think about this episode, so why don't you let me know in the comments below. When you're buying a deck or just individual cards, make sure to use our link in the description. Not only will you be getting great prices on TCG Player, but you're also going to be supporting this show because they sponsor us. And make sure that you follow us on social media so you can get some early hints on who the next commander just might be. Links to our social media accounts can be found in the description. Also in the description below is a link to the Commander's Quarters Patreon page, and I just want to say a quick thank you to the patrons who have subscribed so far. There are many benefits to being a patron for the Commander's Quarters, including being able to vote on future commanders for deck techs. There's even a general level tier where you get your own personalized deck tech dedicated to you. I truly couldn't do this without all of your support, so from the bottom of my heart, thank you. If you haven't already, make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel. And while you're at it, check out some of our other episodes on budget deck techs, Quest for Quarters episodes, Commander topics, and Creators Quarters. And with that, I'm out of here. Thanks again, and have a good one.